Well, here we are back for another episode. What's new, Renee?
Hey, I don't know what's going on. It's new. We're here at the end of April. Life is good. We're almost, I think, officially, I think we hit spring. I think we're getting in the warmer weather. So I'm getting excited because for me, this time of year means I got one more month till the outdoor pool opens. So I'm
Wow.
excited. I know.
I'm already thinking fall, right? I'm in the
Oh,
middle of a
sheesh.
grain bin project and dryer upgrade.
Of
And so
course.
there's foundations being poured and all kinds of things that I'm completely overwhelmed right now. So I should be thinking about planting and everything that goes into that, but I am overwhelmed with projects right now.
Isn't that the way that works? Kind of all construction season and planting season sort of roll into
Oh,
one.
I don't know who
It's
planned all this. Not well.
who's in charge of this anyway?
I don't know.
Well, today we're going to talk about a topic that a lot of people are like, what in the world does jail have to do with the behavioral healthcare system? And we'd love to say the answer is nothing. What? Not true. And it's not just in Iowa where we are located, it's across America for sure, and in some other countries. And so this is a big topic of conversation. And Jason and I have done a lot of work now, and jails have sort of become this de facto situation. And we're going to talk about what we're seeing, and then loop a lot of information today. So you don't have to believe us what we're talking about. There's a lot of data to back it up and to prove it. We're going to put a lot of stuff in the show notes. And I think today's going to go with a whole lot of stories because while we were working on mental health systems, I can't remember how many times the jail systems have been drug into it. Almost every single time, I think. And then some of the tours we've been on, some of the work that we're doing, it's just unbelievable how this is intermingled, even though we hoped it wouldn't be. So Jason, talk to us today about why is it so important we're talking about jail and behavioral health? How do they go together?
Well, I think we've talked about it in previous episodes, especially when we talked about the institutions that, over time, unfortunately, because we've lacked the real supports we need to help people during the course of their mental illness, jails and prisons have become the de facto mental health
Right.
care treatment continuum, right?
Yep.
That folks can't get what they need in the local communities and they end up breaking the law, or jail becomes the safe place. We've been in small towns, Renee, where family members have called the police because they know that they can see a psychiatrist when they go to the local jail and they can't get access to a psychiatrist in any other way. And so the jails become the de facto treatment provider. And it's heartbreaking, really, to see that the legal system has now been used in that way, that it's not really prepared or built to do.
Right. When we talked about, the movement of deinstitutionalization, and for those that don't know what that means is, back in the 1800s, early 1900s, we had all of these big institutions in every state where people were put for mental health or disabilities or different things. And in the 70s, and this is a long time ago now, but back in the 1970s, so in the 19s for all you young people out there, they started telling us we couldn't keep them in institutions. We needed to move them to the community with the goal of community wraparound services. That's been the entire conversation we've had up until this point of what a system should look like, right? We talked about residential services and all the things that should be available. Well, that's not what happened. Everybody pushed everybody out of these facilities. That did happen. But instead, they just kind of moved over to a different facility. And so instead of paying for them in your human services budget, they just moved right over to corrections and it got paid for in the corrections budget. And if you look at graphs, and we use these when we speak out on tour a lot of times, but the graphs are inverted and you can watch the one goes down, the other goes up almost identically in numbers. I mean, it is scary the numbers that as the numbers of people came out of our treatment system, how they went straight into prison. It's just an inverted little V and you can see it. And so because of that, they're there. Now, there are some good things that happen while people are incarcerated for behavioral health. And there's going to be people out there that are going to fight with me about this, and that's fine. But I want to tell you the good things that do happen because prisons in general have a really decent healthcare system for the most part. And for some people, that's the best healthcare they're ever going to get. Not just mental health and behavioral health care, but like dental care. You can go research any of this information about how much dental work is done for folks that have lost their teeth due to substance use and other things. They get brand new sets of teeth and stuff in prison. And so there's a lot of folks that get a lot of really good health care incarcerated. So the upside of this, because there's a lot of downside, and that's going to be the rest of this conversation, but the reasons why it works is because people have to take their medications when they're incarcerated. There's until they reach a certain level. If you're in prison, until you reach a certain level, you don't even get to self-administer. You're in a pill line where you are handed your meds, checked to make sure you've taken them, and to make sure they get down. What does that do? It also stabilizes behavior in a lot of cases, because if people have been maybe misutilizing medications or never taking their medications, this actually gives them an opportunity to get stable on meds. And they're completely different people many times after they're medicated and stable, the way they should have been had they been before. The other thing, that there's counseling sometimes on site, lots of different types of treatment options, tons of cognitive work when they're inside facilities. And so they can talk about like what they've done and kind of make some connections. And there are people, believe it or not, that don't know that some of the things they did were wrong. And it took them becoming clear-minded, sober, plus medications, which happens while incarcerated many times, to understand that their choices were incorrect. And that may seem crazy to most of us, but if you're clear-minded all the time, you may think, well, that seems obvious. You shouldn't murder somebody. But there are other people who are like, well, I wasn't in my right mind. I don't even remember what happened. I blacked out. I don't know that I did that or whatever. And so when you get them sober, which happens while they're inside, while they have those expectations to complete treatment plus taking medication, they become very different people. And so that's the high side of why incarceration and mental health work. Now, should it be taking people to get incarcerated to get this treatment? Absolutely not. And we're not going to say that that's the right place, but it is happening. So I don't want everybody to think, oh, people just get thrown away behind bars and get no help. Actually, in some of the work we've seen, some of the stronger mental health components are in jails or in prisons. Jason, one of the states we traveled to, their prison or their jails, and it was a county jail with a big county, but they were talking about doing much more robust mental health in that system. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think about, yeah, we've had the opportunity to go inside of some jails, and what we saw inside those jails was truly traumatic. But what we did see was jail administrators taking the steps to really create a care continuum where they had on-site ARNPs, medication management, counseling, behavior therapists looking at behavior management, dealing with some very, very sick individuals. Now, we're talking about individuals that were actively hallucinating all of the time, in complete psychosis, individuals that should have never been in a jail setting, in my opinion, in the first place. And they ended up having a whole wing of folks because there was nowhere else in the state that could treat the acuity of the types of individuals and the level of psychosis that they were being asked to treat. And unfortunately, they were having to create their own care continuum because there was nothing else. There was no state institution that was available to support them. And I think that's really highlights the challenges we face in our society across the board, because it's not just in this one county jail. This was happening across the state, of systems adapting. And right now I'm in another state and we're seeing the same thing happen. There's actually going to be in the largest county of the state we're in, they're looking at building a new jail, and the largest wing will be designed around mental health conditions and basically as an institution to treat mental illness. And so
Right.
I struggle, coming to terms with the fact that now we're designing jails as mental health treatment facilities because that's who's coming to jail.
Right. Well, and we talked about this a little bit in a previous episode about competency to stand trial. And so
Yeah.
some of those folks are those in jail. And what is disheartening is, I know our work in another state, I was like, well, I wonder how it works in our state so I could say what the example was. And it wasn't necessarily any better, because if you're incarcerated, you get a bill, by the way, for your time in prison, especially when you're not competent to stand trial. Somebody has to pay for that. And so people are racking up fines, if you will, for daily fines of the time that they're spending not competent to stand trial, as if that's a choice they are making. And then anyway, there's just a mess that goes along with it. And so people, some of these jails are the folks, they're dangerous, at least while on substances and or unmedicated, untreated mental health, they were dangerous at that time. And so they're thought that that's where they need to be held to not harm others, which is a public safety concern. I got all that. But then they're held there until they can figure out if they're competent to stand trial. And we talked about that a little bit before, that we have a couple of different institutions in our states. Other states are trying to grapple with this too, trying to figure out how do we do that, because more and more people are kind of in that state with more and more drug use. And sometimes the psychosis is mental health, psychological based, and sometimes the psychosis came with the drug use. And you cannot necessarily separate the two until somebody's sober and you figure out what's left. And we've talked about this in one of the jail visits we had, that some of the drugs right now that you can take it and then they've permanently damaged their brains to the point that they're not going to recover from that particular drug. And so there's some really bad stuff out there on the streets that if people get into on purpose or accidentally, that then they have brain injuries afterwards, and that might include psychosis and hallucinations and all the things that come with it, and make them a little more challenging to place in a community, because there is a public safety component. But one of the things I just wanted to share as we continue the conversation is, the United States, this is data from back in 2014, but we only have 5% of the world's population, but like 25% of its prisoners. We really like to incarcerate people in America. And this is something that we're working on, because again, just like America really liked our asylums back in the day before we moved away from that system, now it turned into incarceration. And so all we've really done is traded where we stuck people. We just really like to move people out of space, out of sight, out of mind. And this is now becoming kind of a bigger problem, and people are starting to have conversations about this. And so, Jason, you've got a lot of data. We're going to have a ton of stuff in the show notes today that backs this up. But what are you seeing in some of the information about this move toward incarceration?
Yeah, and so we are going to have a ton of data. And so, I do encourage you to kind of look through, Mental Health America has a great, and we're going to put that link in there that kind of helps. You can look at your own state, right? You can kind of see where you're at with your incarceration rate per, 1,000 people, kind of to see where are you at and to get a sense for what's happening in your state. There's also some solutions listed there, right? So as we have this conversation today, sometimes I think we complain a lot, Renee, of all the needs that are out there and what we want to change. But, this is a great way to help you frame the conversation, to have the data, but then also have the solutions, right? Like, what can we do instead of incarcerating folks? Like, what are the actual strategies we can employ in our states so that we can have solutions, so we can have alternatives, right? That we can invest in different ways so that we can find other ways to support people, because we need to have jails for folks who are really violent, right? We talked about that competency piece. During that period of competency restoration, folks are going to need to be housed, right? So we can deal with the legal issues that are happening. But it doesn't mean everyone needs to be in jail all of the time. And we have to do a better job of differentiating, of screening and sorting out what's really happening, and then figuring out how do we do more community-based supports, investing in all of that continuum.
Yeah. So my role right now in parole, by the time I get folks, they're already incarcerated. They've been in prison for who knows how long, for who knows what. And oftentimes, hopefully, by the time I see them, especially if I see them for interviews about release, we're past the point of them being stabilized now and maybe off the substances and stuff of that nature. So I don't see them at the beginning of that journey. I see them toward the end. But, the ongoing conversation always is, what are we going to do to help you not relapse or to stay on your medications while you're out? Because, having a conversation with an inmate about, have you noticed that medications work? And this is my, being mental health background, this is my conversation every time. It's very predictable. But I say, have you noticed whether or not the medications are helping? 9 times out of 10, the answer is yes. And it says, well, do you make better decisions or worse decisions if you're not taking your medications? And they'll be like, I make a lot of worse decisions. And then we'll talk about substance use. And I say, did you make better decisions or worse decisions using substances? And they're like, really bad. And the good conversations turn into, they understand that they were self-medicating to try to handle the mental health stuff going on in their lives, but they were choosing drugs that they then couldn't control. We hear this all the time, is they started out with using blank to try to help them feel better, but after they used blank for a while, it just got worse and made really bad choices. And so, it's one of those things that's where incarceration has been beneficial. It helps them connect those dots. But when we release them and re-enter them in the community, then making sure that those services are available to stay on their medications, to be able to continue with treatment, to be able to plug into services, to get a psychiatrist, to get counseling, that is such a struggle for folks. And that's not just our state, it's in a lot of states. But that's the only way they're going to be successful, is they've got to get, the ongoing supports that they need. And so there are some solutions to this, and it really is just like the conversation we had last episode about children. It's on the prevention side. I mean, it's very similar to this, because if we can stop the pipeline into prison from the front end, that's where the solutions lie. I mean, yes, we can get them sober and get them on treatment, incarcerated, but we've got to do a lot more work upstream. And so what could some of those things kind of look like, Jason?
Well, what I hear you saying is, the importance of community supervision, right? That if we want to get people transitioned, it's all about that transition, and it's about housing, right? Without housing and everything, I feel like we talk about, no matter where we're at, it comes down to stable housing, right? Without someone's basic needs met, how can we support them in their transition back to society? And so, when I hear prevention, I go back to the, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Food, shelter, water, and people can't thrive until the basic needs are met. And thinking about the principles of community supervision, right? We shouldn't be scared of community supervision. We need to have safe places for people to grow and interact and return to society as contributing members, because that can happen and that can be very beneficial in our communities. And there's so much stigma and there's so much offenders have to overcome as they're transitioning out, but we don't always take into account the supports they need based upon their mental health condition or the recovery of a substance use disorder.
Yep. And so again, some of the folks that we work with in our community talk about housing that heals. So I'm going to link just a brief article there just about how California tried this and sort of a pilot project, so you can kind of see what we're talking about. But it's that housing, we talked about this in a previous episode, but again, it's housing that they can't lose. It's like housing, they're going to have to, if you've ever tried to rent or you're trying to own your own place, there's a lot of rules and regulations that come around all of that. And so I can give you an example just this week of an incarcerated situation that we had a very hard time finding housing for. And you're going to say, well, that's obvious as soon as I tell you what they did. So there's domestic violence charges, which, okay, that's one thing. But then there was use of explosives, and explosives are off the list of places that are going to let you live there because they're afraid you're going to burn the house down, just like arson, also not going to place them somewhere. And so these are charges. Now, the situation in this case, person had mental health issues and they were using some sort of drug. I can't remember which one. And they were setting things on fire. And I asked the question, like, what was the purpose? Was it to harm yourself, to harm others? And the purpose was to cause a scene. And I was like, okay, explain that. So they tell me that they were trying to make a big scene or whatever. And so I'm like, it wasn't really to harm others. It wasn't really to harm themselves. And they had no idea what the repercussions of doing such a thing were going to be legally, right? It would turn into something much bigger than they anticipated. But now they can't find housing. And there's countless people like that all across the country. And in this person's mind, it wasn't an intentional trying to harm people. But because it charges look like they do, there's no explosives except for give them an out. They see that on a rental agreement and they're like, no, just no. And so, housing that heals talks about, getting housing, like kind of more permanent housing for folks, but we're going to have to work around some of those charges, some of the felonies, some of the things that kind of have given people a black mark, and then try to keep them stable with those wraparound services. And if you think way back to a few episodes ago, we've talked about assertive community treatment, and ACT teams around housing that heals would be an amazing combination in our IRSH homes, which are your intense residential service homes we talk about again, but an ACT team to wrap around that would be a great opportunity, because an ACT team, if you remember, we talked about that, is a team of professionals that has a person that can come to you, but then they have at their disposal a list of people that can come in and based on this situation. And that's what these folks are going to need, because they maybe can't live in a lot of places in group housing, settings and stuff. They're going to need more individualized places that can be a little more flexible. But, I see the other side too. If I'm the person that's renting out my house, am I going to want somebody who has explosive charges, right? It's like it's a two-way street. So it's going to take growth on both sides to kind of move this forward.
On the other end of the spectrum, Renee, I think about diversion programs, right? So you have folks who have been in the system transitioning out, but we also can do a better job of diverting individuals from getting into that system who shouldn't be in that system because of a substance use disorder or a mental health condition. If we can divert and get people access to treatment sooner so they don't lose their apartment, so they don't lose all of those things that happen when people sit in jail for 30, 60, 90, 120 days while they're waiting for competency. And so I think part of it as well is thinking about what do we do on the prevention end, right? And so there's lots of really good diversion programs. I looked in the county I live in has a really robust diversion program, post-arrest diversion, pre-arrest diversion. All of that stuff is outlined and defined with professionals who
Mhm.
help to identify, screen, look at nonviolent offenders and move people through the system and get them out of jail and get them to the supports they need quickly so that they can stabilize the individual to not have a long-term, issue on their hands.
Right. So, some of the things, if you're out there and you're thinking, well, what's making this difficult and not making this better? Part of it's your legislature. And I'll just be straight up. I was one, so I'm going to call us out. Here we go. But you cannot be, quote, tough on crime and jack up every penalty for every single crime and not expect there to be consequences on the backside of that. It's like, if you're going to make every single thing a felony and then every single thing that was a felony a higher level felony, that puts more and more and more and more people incarcerated. And when you do that, you run out of space. And so, to Jason's point about, a sister state that's looking at building another institution, well, that's going to happen. And that is not the national trend. So our state really likes to be tough on crime, but we're going the opposite direction. And so in the notes where it said, talking about the number of people incarcerated for population, we're 13th in the country. So we're way up there with letting, incarcerating more people per capita than we probably should be. And so there's a lot of work to be done in this space about understanding what happens. And then there are certain types of people, when incarceration actually is more traumatic for them and makes it worse. So we're not actually improving the lives of those folks. We're actually making their lives worse. And the incarceration then becomes a huge trauma that then they have to deal with on the outside. So part of what we're doing in the state is trying to parse out who's who and figuring out, okay, who needs to be confined because that's beneficial to them versus who actually needs to go through quickly, get their treatment, move on, get out, get into some other kind of treatment quickly so that we're not re-traumatizing them by incarcerating them. And so that's big, there's lots of new information, new data. This is a trending topic that's not, you can't do prison the way you've always done it. It's not about just sending people away forever. You have to be thinking about, okay, how do we get them re-entered in the community? And then how do we wrap supports around them? So one of the pieces that I'm really excited about is being able to work in parole and re-entry, is having those conversations with the regions that I've talked with for so long are now districts, is making sure all those people know each other. And Jason, that's going to seem crazy, but it's not crazy, but introducing people and having conversations about, hey, did you know these guys are in your community? Do you know they do these services? Hey, do you know they could go live here? And every time, that's so exciting to me, but we make a new connection. So I know that you've been thinking about that too.
Yeah, and I think a nuance you just said is right. It's not institutions. People are building jails, right? And so prisons are different than institutions are different than jails. And what we're doing is just moving the deck chairs around, right? So every couple of years, then we just move the population somewhere else because there's a federal lawsuit or someone says, well, you can't have people in institutions anymore. So then it's kind of, then folks moved and we started putting people in prisons. And then we're like, well, we can't put everybody in prisons. So then counties took it on in their jails, right? Local jails then took on holding people. We were in a jail. People are there for years. And that's a local jail, right? That's not what jails were originally designed to do, right? And so we just see this movement over time of people just get shifted, right? That nobody solves the problem. We just shift it a little bit in a different direction. And I think that's part of what, as we have this conversation, and I'm going to come back to this piece of data, and we're going to, there was a special report that came back, and this is a little older. This is from '06, but basically it said that 61% of folks had a mental health problem in a state prison. And you can kind of see some of the statistics here of any mental health problem. In a state prison, it was 56%, in federal prison, it was 45%. In a local jail, 64% of the population. And this is back in '06, right? And so, I like to find some newer data for us, but just to give us a starting place of where that was, and to think today, I can't believe it would be any less, and to think how much higher that is. I've heard other statistics that are much higher, but, just going back to what I can cite for you today, I think that really couches the conversation we're having.
Well, I know you'd like to think that the populations in county jails and prisons are all different. They're not. They're the same people.
Right.
Just depends where they are in their season. If they're sitting in
Right.
jail waiting to come back into prison, or from
Right.
prison going out and then come back to
Right.
jail. But either way, I mean, I would bet on parole hearings, what I do now all the time, I bet you I'm at 80% easy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost interesting to me if I see somebody who's committed a crime and there isn't a substance use or a mental health, then I'm almost stumped. Like, you mean you
Uh-huh.
did that clear-minded, right? That's a
Yeah.
very different conversation, because that means you did it. Or does that mean the paperwork's wrong and we just don't know the truth? And I'm still going to ask the questions, because it just looks weird, because it's like, you did that sober-minded. Really? I mean, really? You sure there wasn't anything else? And almost always there's something else. But
Mm-hmm.
occasionally you'll find one, and it actually stumps the psychologists in the system, because we want psychological evaluations, and we're trying to figure out, well, there had to be something. And he's like, I think those are funny to me, because it's basically, well, they just stabbed them, and we want to know if there's psychological reasonings behind it. And psychologist is like, nope, that's actually what they did. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's pretty interesting, but it's just so rare to have crime not related to mental health and substance use. And so it's like the fact that those things need, which is why I'm in parole in the first place. For those that don't know what in the
Right.
world what I do in there, it's because the intersect is so great, and we've just ignored it for so long that I'm like, this has to be a better way. So the bigger the problem, the more the fun. So I jump in and like, well, let's see what we can do about this, because it's our same people. And then they come out into our communities, and they're the same people that other people serve in mental health. And they're the same people that come to our substance use programs. They're the same people. So how do we help them, regardless of where they live, to get the services that they need? And so it's a better conversation that needs to happen. And, on the other side, I mean, there's one more piece that it's been in the news all spring, is about, certain states try to decriminalize substance use. Great idea to reduce population in prison and jail. All it did in many cases was bring more people to the state to use substances, and then exploded the homeless population, just exploded it. And so then the states are having to backtrack on what they thought would be good to decriminalize some things, but all it did, again, moved the deck chairs. Everybody ended up on the streets. And so it didn't, again, fix the issues of joblessness, of lack of housing. It didn't address any of those things. It just moved the party. Then they're not even in jail anymore. Now they're just on the corner. And so it became very dangerous for other people. And so now other states are like, okay, we thought that was the answer. So now what? So now you're going to see the pendulum swing again. And other states who never did it are going to be like, oh, we can't, be less difficult on crime, because look what happened in such and such state. So it didn't exactly help, because it just gave us an example that's bad. So other states are going to be like, see, that's why we're tough on drugs. And then we're going to be right where we are. So there's just a lot to be, again, this is a systemic situation with many different parties. You have to talk to your county attorneys and your justice system. And it's all these different groups that don't typically come together at a table who are talking about this. And again, now it's corrections budget versus or the county budget versus HHS, where they used to be before, but all we did was shift it to somebody else's budget problem, or on the national level, it just moved around to who's responsible. And we didn't really fix it. So again, we need to get back at the table and go, what can we do to help, and not just move people around?
And I think starting at the beginning, right, is we can't have a conversation about behavioral health without having law enforcement at the table.
No.
Because when we talk about entry into the justice system, it starts with your local police force.
That's right.
It starts with the local law enforcement entity. And if they're not part of the behavioral health solution, then we're not fixing anything. And so I think it's a mistake when we try to separate law enforcement and our partners in the law enforcement community from what happens in mobile crisis or what happens in community mental health. They should all be at the same table from day one. And so frequently, we don't see a partnership between our substance use disorder treatment providers, our mental health providers, our mobile crisis teams, and
Right.
local law enforcement. They have to be in partnership and working together at a high level. And unfortunately, I don't see that happening in many states. I see some great initiatives that happen in local areas. There's some cities who really get it and have done some things to actually integrate, but it's not happening across the board. And I think we're missing the boat
Yeah.
when we're not creating those partnerships and figuring out how we all work together.
That's right. Well, today we have a recovering politician self-care policy. And, it got lighter outside finally, right? It's not as dark as it used to be. And that messes up my sleep, man, because I wake up whenever I wake up. My body just does that. And I'm telling you what, the week after the time change is terrible. For anybody back when the time change occurred, I am awful because now I'm off an hour because I'm like wanting to sleep in and I'm sleeping through things. It's just not good for me. I don't know why we still do that. We should keep arguing congressional action. But anyway, now though the sun's up. And so I wake up with the sun. I like being up with the sun, but the sun stays up later. And if I'm not careful, I'm not paying attention, I blow my bedtime. And then I'm back to being exhausted and sleepy and tired and all the things that happen with that. So for me, this time of year, I start thinking about, okay, making sure I stay in a rhythm. I may have to put on, an eye mask or something, or darken shades or something so that I can actually get some sleep when I'm supposed to. Because if the light continues on later and later and later, just like a little kid, man, I just want to be up. And then I'm tired because I don't really sleep in very well. So that's for me, just thinking about my self-care boundary of sleep and just double checking as the seasons change. I need to make sure that I hit that, because if I sleep better, everything in my life is better. Jason, did you have any thoughts?
Well, I didn't know we were talking spring equinox,
Mm,
but I love having more light. And so for
yeah.
me, having light is glorious because I hate being in the dark. And so I love it as the days get longer, that I'm able to be outside more. I just feel better about having sunlight, and longer days. It
Yep.
just gives me more energy. So I look forward to that. Generally, when that happens, the time change, I'm traveling because that happens during spring break. So that helps to buffer the time zone change for me. So
That's
that might
true.
be a strategy you employ. If you go to a different time zone during the time change, it can help a lot,
There you go.
depending on which time zone you go to be able to do that.
My luck with telling time and stuff, I'd get it wrong and then I'd mess it all up and I'd be worse off when I got home. Well, anyway, so today what we talked about was how the jail system and prisons fit into behavioral health. And we know that that's not optimal. That's not our preference, but that's where it sort of has landed with the de facto system. And so we're giving you a lot of resources again today so you can look at the data on this. We're talking about what are some solutions to incarceration, gave you some of those tips, and then talking about stories of things that we see when we're out and about. Starting in the next podcast series, we're going to start talking about what is it that we see? We're on the road again this summer for lots of conferences, lots of things happening, and we've got some basic information that lots of people want to hear. We're going to start diving into that and share with you what do we talk about when we're in conferences, and what are some of those key takeaways that people want to know, because we think it's interesting. We think you will too. We always see all the people's phones come up and take pictures of our slides. So we're going to share some of that information starting next time. So see you then, everybody. Bye.